Cairo, July 1324. The city is dying of gold. Not metaphorically, not poetically. Literally, the price of gold across the entire Mediterranean world has just collapsed because one man passed through the city on his way to Mecca and gave so much of it away that the Egyptian economy will not recover for 12 years. The merchants of Cairo are furious. The gold traders are ruined. The Sultan of Egypt is simultaneously humiliated and astonished. And the man responsible for all of it is already gone, moving east across the desert with a caravan so vast that the people of every city he passes through will talk about it for the next 2 centuries. His name is Mansa Musa. He is the emperor of Mali. He controls more than half the world's gold supply. He has just distributed so much of it through Egypt, in gifts, in purchases, in acts of generosity so extravagant that the eyewitnesses who recorded them struggled to find adequate language, that he has single-handedly caused the worst inflation crisis in the medieval Islamic world. And he did it accidentally. He was not trying to crash the Egyptian economy. He was just being generous. That is the scale of what he was working with. This man, the most powerful ruler in Africa, the wealthiest individual in the recorded history of the human species, the emperor of an empire that produced more gold than the rest of the known world combined, is not in your history textbooks. He is barely in your history curriculum at all. And that absence is not an accident. That absence is a decision. Today we are going to find out who made it, and why, and what they needed you not to know about the man who sat on the lion throne of Mali in the 14th century and ruled the most extraordinary empire the African continent has ever produced. To understand Mansa Musa, you first need to understand what the Mali Empire was. Because the Mali Empire has been reduced in Western historical education to a footnote, a vague reference to a wealthy African king, usually accompanied by an illustration of a man sitting on a pile of gold that manages to simultaneously exoticize and diminish the subject. The reality was something else entirely. The Mali Empire at its 14th century peak covered an area of approximately 2 million square kilometers. That is larger than Western Europe. It stretched from the Atlantic coast of present-day Senegal and Gambia eastward across the Sahel to the Great Bend of the Niger River, encompassing the territories of present-day Mali, Senegal, Gambia, Guinea, Guinea-Bissau, Mauritania and parts of Niger and Burkina Faso. It controlled 3 of the most important trade commodities in the medieval world. Gold from the Bambouk and Bouré goldfields, deposits so rich that the Mali Empire produced somewhere between half and 2/3 of the entire world's gold supply during its peak years. Salt from the Great Saharan mines at Tagaza, a commodity so valuable in sub-Saharan Africa that it was traded pound for pound against gold. And enslaved people from the empire's military campaigns, a trade that, while morally catastrophic by any standard, was economically central to the medieval trans-Saharan commerce that connected West Africa to North Africa and the Islamic world. The empire was administered through a sophisticated bureaucratic system. Provincial governors, called pharaons, managed the empire's regions on behalf of the Mansa. A professional standing army maintained security and expanded the borders. A court system administered justice according to a combination of traditional Mande law and Islamic legal principles. A postal system carried messages across the empire's vast distances with remarkable efficiency. The capital city of Niani, on the upper Niger River in present-day Guinea, was a sophisticated urban center with a royal palace, mosques, markets, and a population of tens of thousands. The trading cities of Djen and Timbuktu on the Niger River were among the most cosmopolitan urban environments in the 14th century world, places where Arab scholars, Berber merchants, Tuareg traders, West African farmers, and Saharan nomads met, traded, argued, and built. This was not a primitive society waiting to be discovered by Europeans. This was a civilization. And Mansa Musa was its greatest emperor. Mansa Musa came to power in approximately 1312 through a succession process that the Mali Empire had developed to manage the transfer of imperial authority. His predecessor, Mansa Abu Bakr II, had abdicated the throne in pursuit of one of the most extraordinary ambitions in the history of exploration. Abu Bakr had become convinced that the Atlantic Ocean could be crossed. He equipped 2,000 boats with men, provisions and gold, and sent them westward into the Atlantic to find whatever lay on the other side. When none of them returned, he equipped 2,000 more boats and led the second expedition himself. He was never seen again. Whether Abu Bakr's fleet perished in the Atlantic currents or reached the Americas nearly 2 centuries before Columbus, a theory that some historians take seriously and others dismiss entirely, is a question that cannot be answered from the available evidence. What is certain is that he was gone and the lion throne of Mali was empty. Mansa Musa inherited it. He was a devout Muslim, educated in the Islamic scholarly tradition, literate in Arabic, deeply committed to the practice and promotion of his faith. He was also a pragmatist of the highest order, a man who understood that the Mali Empire's wealth gave him a position in the Islamic world that no previous Malian ruler had occupied, and who intended to use that position deliberately and strategically. He set about making the Mali Empire impossible to ignore. In 1324, Mansa Musa made a decision that would change the medieval world. He would perform the Hajj, the Islamic pilgrimage to Mecca that is one of the 5 pillars of the faith, obligatory for every Muslim who is physically and financially capable of making it. Mansa Musa was more than financially capable. He was the wealthiest human being on earth. And he was not going to make this pilgrimage quietly. The preparations took years. The logistics were staggering. What Mansa Musa assembled for his journey to Mecca was not a traveling party. It was a mobile city. 60,000 people in his entourage. His senior wife Inari Kant traveling with her own retinue of 500 personal attendants. 12,000 personal slaves, each carrying a staff of solid gold weighing approximately 4 pounds. 80 camels, each carrying between 50 and 300 pounds of gold dust. Heralds and griots, the oral historians and praise singers of the Monde tradition, marching ahead of the procession announcing his arrival. Soldiers, scholars, merchants, cooks, doctors, architects, musicians. The caravan stretched so far in every direction that the people watching from the edges of the road could not see its beginning or its end. Mansa Musa himself rode on horseback. He wore robes of the finest brocade and Chinese silk. He was preceded wherever he went by 500 slaves, each bearing a staff of gold, fanning out before him to clear and prepare his path. He was going to Mecca, and the entire medieval world was going to know about it. The road to Mecca. The caravan moved north and east, across the Sahel, through the desert, into the Maghreb and then east along the North African coast toward Egypt. Everywhere it stopped, Mansa Musa gave. In every city, every town, every village along the route, he distributed gold. To the poor, to the mosques, to the scholars, to the merchants, to the officials who received him, to the ordinary people who lined the roads to watch him pass. He gave with the instinctive generosity of a man for whom gold was so abundant that its value as a display of wealth was less important than its value as a demonstration of character. The chronicler Al-Amari, an Egyptian scholar who spent years after the visit interviewing people who had met Mansa Musa personally, recorded the testimony of one official who said that Mansa Musa had given him so much gold during a single encounter that the man's entire economic circumstances had been permanently transformed. This was not unusual. It was the norm. By the time Mansa Musa reached Cairo, where he was received by the Sultan of Egypt, Al-Nasir Muhammad, the stories of his generosity had preceded him by weeks. The meeting between the two men became immediately complicated by a question of protocol. The Sultan expected Mansa Musa to prostrate himself before him, the standard greeting of a visiting ruler to the Egyptian Sultan. Mansa Musa refused. He was a free man, he said, and he prostrated himself before God alone. The Sultan's court held its breath. Mansa Musa held his ground. The Sultan, after a moment of extraordinary tension, accepted this. He received Mansa Musa as an equal. A 14th-century African emperor had just looked the most powerful ruler in the Islamic world in the eye and declined to bow. And the Sultan had blinked. The gold crash. What happened in Cairo during Mansa Musa's stay is one of the most extraordinary economic events in the history of the medieval world. He was there for approximately 3 months. He spent the entire time giving gold away. To the mosques of Cairo, he gave enough gold to fund construction and renovation projects that lasted decades. To the scholars and religious leaders who visited him, he gave so generously that men who arrived at his quarters with modest expectations left wealthy. To the merchants from whom he purchased goods for his onward journey, he paid prices so far above market value that the sellers could not believe what was happening. To the beggars and poor of Cairo, he distributed gold in quantities that the city had never seen distributed by a single individual. He also borrowed. Remarkably, despite carrying an almost incomprehensible quantity of gold, Mansa Musa ran short of spending money during his stay in Cairo and was forced to borrow from Egyptian merchants at interest, a detail that the chroniclers recorded with some bewilderment, since the man borrowing at interest was simultaneously giving away more gold than most rulers possessed in their entire treasuries. The economic consequences were catastrophic. The gold market of Cairo, and through Cairo the gold markets of the entire Mediterranean world, which were intimately connected through the trans-Saharan trade networks, collapsed under the weight of the supply Mansa Musa had introduced. Gold's value is determined by its scarcity. When Mansa Musa flooded the Cairo market with gold on a scale the city had never experienced, the price of gold dropped sharply and stayed down. Merchants who had built their businesses on the stable value of gold found their inventories suddenly worth significantly less. The inflation that followed, as gold-denominated prices across the economy adjusted to the new reality of gold abundance, devastated the Egyptian mercantile class for a generation. Al-Amari recorded the testimony of merchants who were still angry about it more than a decade later. Mansa Musa eventually understood what he had done. On his return journey from Mecca, he attempted to correct the situation by buying back gold from the Cairo merchants at above-market prices, effectively trying to remove the excess gold from circulation. The attempt helped but did not fully repair the damage. The Egyptian economy took 12 years to fully recover from the generosity of one man passing through on his way to pray. If you are watching this, and I know you are, before we get to Timbuktu, to the university, to the manuscripts, to the intellectual civilization that Mansa Musa built and that was subsequently erased from Western historical consciousness, I need to pause for a moment. This channel exists to find the stories they buried, the emperors they made into footnotes, the civilizations they decided did not count, the truths that somebody needed you not to know. If this video has already given you a Mansa Musa you never knew existed, hit the like button right now. It costs you nothing, and it tells the algorithm that this kind of serious, honest, African history deserves to be seen by more people. You would be making that happen directly. Subscribe if you are not already here. Every week we go deeper into the stories they left out of the textbooks. Mansa Musa is one of them. There are hundreds more. And drop a comment below. One word. The word that describes what you are feeling right now about the fact that you were not taught about this man. Just one word. We read every single one. Back to the empire. Mansa Musa completed his Hajj and arrived in Mecca as one of the most famous men in the Islamic world. His journey had been talked about across the entire trans-Saharan trade network for months before he arrived. The scholars and religious leaders of Mecca and Medina received him with a recognition that no previous Malian ruler had experienced. He was not simply a wealthy African king making the pilgrimage. He was a major political figure of the medieval Islamic world, a ruler whose empire controlled more gold than any other sovereign on earth and whose generosity had become legendary before he had even reached his destination. In Mecca, Mansa Musa did something that would have consequences for the Mali Empire for generations. He met the greatest architect in the Islamic world. Abu Ishaq Ibrahim al-Sahili was an Andalusian poet and architect from Granada, a man of extraordinary talent who was living in the Hijaz when Mansa Musa arrived. The two men formed an immediate connection. Mansa Musa recognized in al-Sahili the instrument for a project he had been planning, the physical transformation of the Mali Empire cities into architectural expressions of Islamic civilization that would make the empire's sophistication visible and undeniable to the world. He persuaded al-Sahili to return to Mali with him. He paid him 200 kilograms of gold for the journey. Al-Sahili would spend the rest of his life in West Africa, designing the buildings that gave Timbuktu its distinctive architectural character, the great mosques with their unique Sudano-Sahelian style, the thick mud brick walls with protruding wooden beams, the forms that became so distinctive that they are now considered one of the defining architectural achievements of the medieval world. When Mansa Musa returned to Mali, he turned his attention to a project that was, in its long-term significance, more important than the Hajj itself. He was going to make Timbuktu the intellectual capital of the known world. Timbuktu in the early 14th century was already a significant trading city. Positioned at the point where the trans-Saharan trade routes met the Niger River, it was a natural crossroads for the merchants of North Africa, the Sahara and the West African interior. Gold and salt moved through it in enormous quantities. Arab and Berber merchants maintained permanent residences there. It had mosques, markets, and a growing reputation as a place of Islamic learning. Mansa Musa transformed it into something else entirely. He expanded and rebuilt the Jingareber Mosque, commissioning al-Sahili to design a structure that would be worthy of the empire's ambitions. He established the Sankor Mosque and its associated madrasa, the institution that would grow into what historians now call the University of Sankor, one of the greatest centers of learning in the medieval world. At its peak, the University of Sankore enrolled approximately 25,000 students. 25,000. In a city whose total population was perhaps 100,000, 1 in 4 residents was a student. The university offered instruction in the Quran, Islamic law, rhetoric, grammar, geography, history, mathematics, astronomy, and medicine. Its faculty included scholars from across the Islamic world, from Egypt, from Morocco, from Andalusia, from Persia, who came to Timbuktu because Mansa Musa had made it worth their while to come. The manuscripts they produced and accumulated, the texts of Islamic law, philosophy, mathematics and science that the scholars of Timbuktu wrote and copied and preserved, numbered in the hundreds of thousands. By some estimates, the libraries of Timbuktu at their peak contained between 700,000 and 1 million individual manuscripts. 700,000 manuscripts. In a city in West Africa. In the 14th century. While Western Europe was emerging from the medieval period with literacy rates that hovered in the single digits among the general population, the city of Timbuktu was producing and preserving scholarship at a scale that rivaled the great intellectual centers of the Islamic world. This is what Mansa Musa built. This is what your textbooks left out. The man himself. Al-Amari's account of Mansa Musa, drawn from interviews with people who had met him personally in Cairo, gives us the most detailed portrait of the man behind the gold. He was, by the accounts of those who met him, a man of genuine personal warmth combined with absolute imperial authority. He spoke through an interpreter in official contexts, not because he could not speak Arabic, which he could, but because speaking through an interpreter was the protocol of a sovereign receiving foreign officials, and Mansa Musa observed protocol with precision. He was physically imposing, tall, well-built, carrying himself with the bearing of a man who had never been in a room where he was not the most important person present, yet without the performance of dominance that lesser rulers often substituted for genuine authority. He was deeply, genuinely pious. The Islamic faith was not a political instrument for Mansa Musa, or rather it was not only a political instrument. He prayed. He fasted. He studied. He surrounded himself with scholars not merely to display his sophistication, but because he was genuinely interested in what they had to say. And he was generous in a way that the chroniclers struggled to adequately convey. Generous not as a calculated display of wealth, but as a fundamental expression of character. He gave because giving was, for him, the natural response to having. He died in approximately 1337. The exact date is uncertain. The exact cause is unrecorded. He was somewhere in his 50s, a man who had ruled for 25 years, transformed an empire, performed the most famous pilgrimage in the history of medieval Africa and built an intellectual civilization that would outlast him by 2 centuries. He left behind an empire that covered 2 million square kilometers, a university with 25,000 students, libraries containing hundreds of thousands of manuscripts, and a gold crash in Cairo that people were still talking about when his grandson was emperor. He left behind the most extraordinary individual legacy in the history of the African continent. And then history decided he did not matter. Mansa Musa's successors could not hold what he had built. This is not unusual in imperial history. The builder of an empire's peak is rarely followed by someone capable of maintaining it at that level. What happened to the Mali Empire after Mansa Musa's death in approximately 1337 is a story of fragmentation, external pressure and internal succession conflict that reduced the greatest empire in African history to a regional power within 2 generations. His son Mansa Magan inherited the throne and proved incapable of the military and administrative demands of ruling an empire of this scale. The Mossi kingdoms raided from the south. The Tuareg pressed from the north. The subject peoples of the empire's eastern territories began testing the limits of Mali's control. Mansa Magan died after 4 years. His successor Mansa Suleiman, Mansa Musa's brother, stabilized the empire for a generation through capable administration and shrewd diplomacy. Ibn Battuta visited during Suleiman's reign in 1352 and left an account that, while sometimes critical of what he found, confirmed the empire's continued wealth and administrative sophistication. The gold was still there. The cities were still functioning. The trade networks were still intact. But after Suleiman, the decline accelerated. A series of weak rulers, disputed successions, and provincial rebellions gradually stripped the empire of its outlying territories. The Songhai Empire, centered on the Niger River city of Gao, which had been a subject kingdom under Mansa Musa, began asserting its independence and eventually its dominance. By the early 15th century, the Mali Empire had lost control of Timbuktu to the Tuareg. By the late 15th century, the Songhai Empire had eclipsed it entirely. The final blow came from the north. In 1591, a Moroccan army equipped with firearms, a technology that the West African empires had not yet acquired, crossed the Sahara and destroyed the Songhai Empire at the Battle of Tondabai. The army was small by any conventional military standard, but it had guns, and the Songhai cavalry had spears, and the outcome was not in doubt. The destruction of the Songhai Empire, the successor state that had grown from what remained of Mansa Musa's Mali, ended the era of the great West African empires. It also destroyed the institutional infrastructure of Timbuktu. The scholars fled. The manuscripts were scattered. The university ceased to function as a coherent institution. The accumulated intellectual achievement of 2 centuries of West African Islamic scholarship was dispersed across the desert. Some of the manuscripts survived. Families hid them, carried them, preserved them across generations at enormous personal cost. In 2012, when Islamic extremist militants seized Timbuktu and began destroying the city's cultural heritage, local librarians and community members smuggled approximately 350,000 manuscripts out of the city in rice sacks and footlockers and car boots, saving them from destruction. 350,000 manuscripts. Still existing. Still being catalogued and studied. The physical remnant of what Mansa Musa built, surviving in rice sacks in the 21st century because the people of Timbuktu understood what they were worth even when the rest of the world had forgotten. Now we need to ask the question that this channel was built to ask. Why is Mansa Musa not in your textbooks? Not a footnote. Not a paragraph. Not a chapter. In most Western educational curricula, American, British, European, Mansa Musa does not exist. The Mali Empire does not exist. The University of Sankore does not exist. The 700,000 manuscripts do not exist. The gold crash of 1324 that devastated the Egyptian economy for 12 years does not exist. A man who was by any measurable standard the wealthiest individual in the recorded history of the human species, wealthier than John D. Rockefeller, wealthier than Andrew Carnegie, wealthier than any tech billionaire who has ever appeared on a Forbes list, is absent from the education of hundreds of millions of students across the Western world. This did not happen by accident. The construction of Western historical curricula in the 18th and 19th centuries, the period when modern educational systems were being built across Europe and North America, coincided precisely with the height of the transatlantic slave trade and the European colonial project in Africa. The ideological foundation of both required a specific understanding of Africa, as a continent without significant civilizations, without sophisticated states, without intellectual traditions, without history in the meaningful sense of the word. The philosopher George Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, one of the most influential thinkers in the history of Western education, wrote in 1830 that Africa was no historical part of the world, and that it had no movement or development to exhibit. He was wrong in a way that the historical record makes obvious. But his influence on the construction of Western historical curricula was profound and lasting. If Africa had no history, then Mansa Musa did not matter. If the Mali Empire was not a real civilization, then its universities and manuscripts and gold trade were curiosities at best and fabrications at worst. If the transatlantic slave trade was justified by the cultural inferiority of the people it enslaved, then evidence of African intellectual and political sophistication was not just inconvenient, it was dangerous. So it was left out. Not by one person. Not by one decision. But by thousands of individual choices made by thousands of curriculum designers, textbook writers, university professors, and educational policymakers over 2 centuries, each one operating within a framework that had already decided what counted as history and what did not. Mansa Musa did not count. Until now, he still does not count in most classrooms. That is what this video exists to change. What remains? The Jingareber Mosque still stands in Timbuktu. Al-Sahili designed it in the 1320s under Mansa Musa's commission. It has been rebuilt and restored multiple times across 7 centuries. Mud brick architecture requires constant maintenance in the Saharan climate, but its essential form, its distinctive silhouette against the desert sky, its protruding wooden beams and its great tower, remains what Al-Sahili conceived in the 14th century. It is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. It is one of the oldest mosques in sub-Saharan Africa. It was built by an Andalusian architect working for a West African emperor who had just returned from the most famous pilgrimage in the history of medieval Africa. The manuscripts are still being studied. The Timbuktu Manuscripts Project and various international scholarly initiatives are working to digitize and catalog the hundreds of thousands of documents that survived. Texts of Islamic law, mathematics, astronomy, medicine, history, and literature that represent one of the greatest surviving archives of medieval scholarship anywhere in the world. The gold fields of Bambuk and Beret still exist. The gold is still there. The trade routes that Mansa Musa's empire controlled have been replaced by modern roads and railways, but the geography that made the Mali Empire possible, the rivers, the Saharan crossings, the agricultural zones of the Sahel, is unchanged. And somewhere beneath the modern city of Niani in Guinea, the foundations of the capital city of the greatest empire in African history are still in the ground, waiting for the archaeology that will eventually reveal what Mansa Musa's home actually looked like. The richest human being who ever lived was an African emperor in the 14th century. He controlled more gold than the rest of the known world combined. He performed a pilgrimage so extravagant that it crashed the Egyptian economy for 12 years by accident. He built a university that enrolled 25,000 students. He commissioned architecture that is still standing 7 centuries later. He presided over an intellectual tradition that produced hundreds of thousands of manuscripts that people are still risking their lives to protect today. His name was Mansa Musa, and you were not taught about him. That absence is not a gap in the curriculum. It is a choice made by a historical tradition that needed Africa to be empty in order to justify what it was doing to Africa. Your textbooks lied to you, not by telling you false things about Mansa Musa, by telling you nothing at all. Now you know, and knowing changes the obligation. Because once you know that the richest human being who ever lived was an African emperor who built universities and crashed gold markets and refused to bow to the Sultan of Egypt, you cannot unknow it. You cannot go back to the curriculum that pretended he did not exist and accept its version of history as complete. If this video gave you something, if it gave you a Mansa Musa you are going to carry with you, do 3 things before you leave. Hit the like button. 1 second. It tells the world that African history deserves a serious audience. Subscribe to this channel. Every week we find another story they buried, another empire they erased, another truth that powerful people needed you not to know. Mansa Musa was one of them. There are hundreds more waiting. And share this video. Not to everyone. To one specific person, the person in your life who thinks they know African history and has never heard this name. Send it to them today. The Jingareber Mosque is still standing in Timbuktu. The manuscripts are still in the rice sacks. And the richest human being who ever lived is still waiting for the history lesson he deserves. You just gave it to him. See you on the next one.